She arrived in the neighborhood on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, carrying 2 bags and a story. The story was simple. Her husband had been killed in the south. A roadside bomb, they said, near the village where his family had farmed for 3 generations. She had no children. She had no one left in that village. She had come to Beirut because a cousin knew someone who knew of a room, and because grief, she told the woman downstairs, makes it impossible to stay where every wall holds a face. The woman downstairs believed her. The landlord believed her. The family across the hall, who brought her food the first week without being asked, believed her completely. In a city where nearly every family had lost someone to a war, the shape of grief was instantly recognizable. Nobody questioned it. Nobody had reason to. That was the point. What follows draws on what is known. Documented Mossad methods, confirmed infiltrations, real people whose cases are part of the public record, and what can be responsibly reconstructed from the pattern they left behind. Israel maintains a 50-year non-disclosure rule on active intelligence operations. The specific operation this script reconstructs has not been confirmed in any public document. What has been confirmed in detail across declassified accounts, court records, journalistic investigations, and the on-record testimony of former Mossad directors is everything that made an operation like this possible. The cover, the city, the method, the cost. This is what that looks like when it works. There is a particular problem that every intelligence service operating in a closed, ideologically cohesive community eventually confronts. Hezbollah, by the early 2000s, had built one of the most sophisticated internal security cultures of any non-state armed group in the world. It had done this not through technology. Israel's signals intelligence consistently outpaced Hezbollah's countermeasures, but through social architecture. The organization understood that the greatest threat to its secrecy was not a satellite or a listening device. It was a person who didn't belong, noticed by someone who knew the neighborhood well enough to feel the wrongness of them. Hezbollah's senior commanders moved through specific communities in Beirut's southern suburbs, in the Bekaa Valley, in the border towns of southern Lebanon. These were communities defined by shared history, shared loss, shared ideology. A stranger with the wrong accent, the wrong clothing, the wrong pattern of movement, the wrong set of relationships, any of these things would generate suspicion within days. The community was the security system. It was also the reason that signals intelligence and aerial surveillance, however precise, could only tell you so much. They could locate a commander. They could not tell you what he said inside his own home. The gap between what Israel could see from above and what it needed to know at ground level was not a minor operational inconvenience. It was a structural problem. Aerial and signals intelligence can confirm a location. It can track a vehicle. It can intercept a transmission. What it cannot do is penetrate the domestic interior of a protected life, the decisions made in a kitchen, the visitors who arrive informally and leave without documentation, the moods and patterns that a man's family knows and his security detail does not. After the 2006 war with Hezbollah ended without the decisive result Israel had expected, Israeli intelligence agencies underwent a major reorientation. Officials told the New York Times, in a December 2024 investigation sourced to 10 current and former American and Israeli officials, that Israel spent the following 2 decades systematically mapping Hezbollah at a level of granularity it had never previously achieved. Unit 8200, Israel's Signals Intelligence Directorate, mined vast quantities of communications data. Mossad expanded its human intelligence networks, recruiting Lebanese nationals inside Hezbollah's orbit to gather information about commanders, weapons caches, and internal communications. The intelligence that eventually enabled Israel to track Nasrallah's precise movements, to build target portfolios for nearly 200 Hezbollah leaders and operatives, to detonate thousands of booby-trapped pagers simultaneously in September 2024, all of it was assembled over years, layer by layer, through a combination of technology and human access that neither alone could have produced, The human layer is where women became operationally essential. Former Mossad director Tamir Pardo identified one of the solutions publicly in a BBC interview. Women, he said, have a distinct advantage in covert work. Not because of seduction, that is the mythology, not the methodology, but because of perception. In a high-threat environment, a woman in a domestic role occupies social space that a man simply cannot. She can be present without being suspected. She can be helpful without being analyzed. She can build relationships inside a household, with the wives, the sisters, the mothers, the neighbors, that no male operative could access without triggering immediate scrutiny. According to Israeli reports from 2017, women comprise 40% of Mossad's personnel and hold 24% of senior positions. That number is not a diversity statistic. It reflects what decades of operational experience had confirmed. In the environments where Mossad most needed access, women got further, more reliably, and at lower risk of exposure. In the intelligence tradecraft built over decades by Mossad's operational division Caesarea, this was not a secondary consideration. It was a primary tactical asset. The domestic cover, the woman who appears to belong to the civilian fabric of a place, was not a disguise. It was the weapon itself. Erica Chambers understood this. A British-Israeli operative recruited by Mossad in 1973, Chambers would go on to demonstrate the principle in the most precise terms possible. But before that operation, before Chambers in Beirut and a red Volkswagen on a January afternoon, the principle had to be built, tested, and proven across years of operational experience in exactly the kind of environment that Hezbollah later perfected. What Mossad learned across those years was this: the most useful cover is not the most elaborate one. It is the most emotionally familiar one. A widow in a Lebanese community shaped by decades of war is not a curiosity. She is not remarkable. She is, in the most precise sense, invisible, not because no one sees her, but because everyone who sees her already understands what she is. The story writes itself. The community fills in the details without being asked. Sympathy becomes cover. Familiarity becomes access. And access, over time, becomes intelligence. The cover works because it does not ask anyone to believe something unusual. It asks them to recognize something they already know. A Mossad cover identity is not a fake passport and a rehearsed backstory. That is the version that exists in fiction. The version that exists in operational reality is something considerably more demanding and considerably more fragile. The intelligence term is legend. A legend is a complete constructed life, not just a name and a nationality, but a history that can be cross-referenced, a set of relationships that can be verified at least partially, a pattern of behavior that coheres under sustained observation. For a short-duration operation, a week, 2 weeks, a targeted meeting, a thin legend can hold. For a long-duration embedded operation in a community where everyone knows everyone, a thin legend will kill you. The war widow cover, in the Lebanese context of the early 2000s, had to be architecturally sound in specific ways. The husband had to be dead in a way that was unverifiable but plausible, a fighter killed in the south, in the years of Israeli occupation and withdrawal, where thousands of young men from Hezbollah-aligned families had in fact died. The village of origin had to be real, remote enough to be difficult to check, but well known enough to be emotionally resonant. The cause of death had to be consistent with the period: a roadside bomb, a sniper, an airstrike, specific enough to feel remembered, vague enough to resist fact-checking. Lebanon's history made this easier. Between the Israeli occupation that ended in 2000, the internal conflicts of the 1980s and 1990s, and the ongoing low-level violence along the border, there was no shortage of plausible death scenarios for a young man from the South. The widow's story did not need to be original. It needed to be one version of a story that nearly every family in the community had already lived. The genius of the cover was that it borrowed its credibility from mass tragedy. No one questioned it because everyone recognized it. Questioning a war widow's story would mean questioning every other story in the neighborhood. The operative's relationship to the community she was entering had to be explained by the cover's internal logic. She was here because grief had displaced her. She was here because a connection, real or invented, had made this neighborhood the only place available. She was not asking for sympathy, she was simply surviving. This last element is critical and easy to misunderstand. The cover does not work because it generates pity. It works because it generates normality. A widow who is openly grief-stricken becomes a figure to be managed. People feel obligated, they check on her, they notice her. A widow who is quietly functional, who thanks her neighbors and takes care of her space, and occasionally accepts a meal without making it an occasion, she becomes part of the background. She becomes a fixture. The operative's first task, in any long-duration embedded cover, is to become boring. Mossad's selection criteria for this category of operation reflect how difficult this actually is. Former director Ephraim Halavi said publicly that placing a woman in a hostile environment as a sole operative is, in his words, a heavy burden on any Mossad chief who signs the operation. Not because women are less capable, the record is unambiguous on that, but because the psychological demand of sustained solo cover maintenance at close range, over months and years, without the relief of any unguarded moment, is among the most extreme conditions in intelligence work. The operative must never relax. She must never refer to something she would not know. She must never react with the wrong rhythm to a question she was not expecting. She must be able to hold an entire constructed past in her mind with the same fluency she holds her actual past. And she must do this not in controlled debriefs, but in the middle of ordinary conversation, while chopping vegetables in a neighbor's kitchen, while sitting in a shared taxi, while someone is telling her something that, in her real life, she would react to differently. The preparation for this is extensive. Language immersion is only the beginning. Accent calibration, regional dialect, cultural reference points, specific memories of a specific geography, all of it has to be inhabited, not performed. The difference between inhabiting and performing is exactly what the people around her will sense, even if they cannot name it. There is also the question of religion. In a community organized around Shia Islam, religious practice is not optional cover decoration. It is daily life. The operative had to pray correctly, observe correctly, speak about faith correctly, not as someone who had studied these practices, but as someone for whom they were as unconscious as breathing. A woman who prays with the slight hesitation of someone who learned the movements rather than grew up with them will be noticed. Not consciously necessarily, but in the peripheral awareness of people who share a faith, the wrongness registers. The cover that the operative brought into that Beirut neighborhood had been built over months before she arrived. The story of her husband, the name of the village, the details of her life before, all of it was in place before she knocked on the first door. What was not in place, and could not be, was what came next. That was the part she had to build herself, one conversation at a time. Access is not a single event, it is an accumulation. The commander whose household the operation was designed to penetrate was not accessible directly. No Hezbollah figure of significance is. The security culture of the organization runs on compartmentalization. The senior figure's movements, schedules, and internal communications are known only to a tight inner circle. His family occupies a separate social world, one that intersects with the community around it, but maintains clear, if informal, boundaries. What that social world has, which the security apparatus does not control, is the network of women. The wives, sisters, and mothers of Hezbollah figures live within the same community as everyone else. They shop, they visit, they receive neighbors. They observe the Islamic social calendar. They form the kind of close-range relationships that are common in communities built around shared ideology and shared loss. These relationships are not considered a security risk. They are considered part of the community's fabric. Nobody briefs them on operational security. Nobody tells them what not to say in front of the new widow from the south who has been bringing food to the family across the hall. The operative did not attempt to access the commander directly. She did not insert herself into his professional environment. She did not try to cultivate him. That would have generated suspicion within days in a security-conscious organization. She cultivated the women. She was helpful in the way that someone with no other demands on her time can afford to be. She was present at the right moments, when a child was sick, when a delivery needed to be received, when a meal needed a second pair of hands. She was discreet in the way that a woman carrying her own grief learns to be. She did not ask questions. She listened. She commented on what she was told, not on what she was trying to learn, and the two things are operationally very different. The distinction matters because it changes the texture of every interaction. A person who asks questions is gathering information. A person who listens is providing company. In a community where women carry the weight of the household while men carry the weight of the organization, a woman who provides company without asking for anything in return is valuable in a way that has nothing to do with intelligence. She is simply someone to be with, someone who understands, without explanation, what it is to wait for news, to manage a household under pressure, to maintain an appearance of normalcy while everything external is uncertain. The operative understood this because she had been trained to understand it, and because she had studied, in the months of preparation before her arrival, the specific social grammar of the community she was entering. But understanding it and inhabiting it are different things. The first time she sat in a neighbor's kitchen and said nothing useful, and still left having made the situation better, that was not training. That was the cover finding its own form. Over weeks, the relationships deepened in the way that relationships do when the circumstances are right and the other person is skilled. She was invited inside. She was trusted with small things. She was present in the domestic space of the household in the way that a neighbor becomes present, unremarkably, naturally, as a fixture of the daily rhythm. There is a moment in this kind of operation, undocumented, unremarkable from the outside, but operationally significant, when the operative realizes that she has become trusted enough that she is no longer being observed. The family has stopped registering her presence as something that requires processing. She has passed from the category of new person to the category of fixture. When that happens, she can observe without being watched observing. She can be present in a room without her presence being the subject of anyone's attention. That transition, from noticed to unremarkable, is the point at which the operation begins to produce intelligence. It is also the point at which the cover becomes most dangerous. Because the closer the access, the more consequential any crack in the legend. To understand what Mossad knew this method could do, it is necessary to go back to a January afternoon in 1979, to a Beirut street, to a woman sitting on a balcony with a canvas on an easel. Erica Chambers was born in the United Kingdom in 1948. Her father was an engineer who designed racing cars. Her mother came from a Czechoslovak Jewish family, most of whom had been killed in the Holocaust. Chambers studied at the University of Southampton, spent time in Australia, and eventually came to Israel, where she studied hydrology at Hebrew University. In 1973, Mossad recruited her. 2 years later, she assumed a false British identity and began operational work. The target that Mossad assigned her in late 1978 was one of the most difficult in the organization's history. Ali Hassan Salameh was the chief of operations for Black September. He had helped plan the 1972 Munich massacre in which 11 Israeli athletes were taken hostage and killed. He was, by the mid-1970s, also a protected asset of the CIA, which complicated Israeli efforts to reach him. He was known to Israeli intelligence as the Red Prince, a reference both to his PLO pedigree and to his extraordinary personal flamboyance. He drove sports cars, surrounded himself with beautiful women, and frequented Beirut's finest hotels. He had, by Mossad's count, survived 5 prior assassination attempts. After the 5th failure, Mossad recognized that direct approaches were not working. Salameh's personal security detail was excellent. His movements were unpredictable. He changed his routes, he changed his schedules. The only predictable thing about him was his domestic life, specifically his habit of spending afternoons with his wife, Georgina Risk, the Lebanese woman who had been Miss Universe in 1971, at her apartment in Snoubra, West Beirut. The domestic space was the only point of reliable pattern. Chambers arrived in Beirut in November 1978, traveling on a 1975 issued British passport. Her cover was a British charity worker supporting Palestinian orphan welfare organizations. She had been, in the language of the cover, invited to Beirut to assist a group called the House of Steadfastness of the Children of Tel Sada. Her manner was bohemian. Her neighbors in the building she moved into found her eccentric but harmless, a quiet woman who spent her days painting street scenes from her balcony, and every morning, without fail, came downstairs to feed the stray cats. On January 10, 1979, she paid 3,500 Lebanese pounds to rent an apartment on the 8th floor of the Anis Asaf building on Baker Street. The apartment's balcony had an unobstructed view of the route Salame traveled between Georgina Risk's flat and his own. For 12 days, she painted. She noted his convoy's timing. She noted the vehicles. She noted the variation in his schedule and the pattern underlying the variation. She confirmed, across those 12 days of observation from a balcony where a woman painting street scenes attracted no attention whatsoever, the precise window within which the operation could execute. On January 22, 1979, at 3:35 in the afternoon, Salame's convoy, 2 Chevrolet station wagons, moved down Rue Verdun past a red Volkswagen that had been parked there by another Mossad operative days earlier. The Volkswagen contained 100 kilograms of explosive. Chambers was on her balcony. The convoy turned onto Rue Madame Curie. She pushed the remote detonator. The explosion killed Salama. It also killed 4 of his bodyguards and 4 bystanders, including a West German nun and a British secretary named Susan Wareham. 18 others were wounded. The blast was heard across the city. That same day, Chambers informed her neighbors in apparent shock that she would feel safer in a hotel. She left. She never returned. She and 2 other Mossad operatives were extracted by boat from the Beirut shore to an Israeli missile boat waiting offshore. When investigators later combed the apartment, they found a British passport bearing the name Erica Chambers. The Volkswagen was traced to a rental company that had been used by a Mossad team in a previous operation. In Israel, she received the Medal for Distinguished Service. A former Mossad director, speaking to Winnet years later, said, "She spent many months there, almost on her own. She was the one who had to decide when to pull the trigger and assassinate Salama, almost on her own, in a city at war, under a cover that held for months because it was built on the right principle. A woman in a domestic role, present without being suspected, unremarkable by design." Yasser Arafat stood at Salama's funeral and said, "We have lost a lion." 100,000 people came to bury him. The woman who had watched him die from a balcony was already gone. What Erica Chambers proved in 1979 was not just that the operation worked. She proved that the domestic cover, the woman who belongs to the civilian texture of a place, could hold at the closest possible range for as long as necessary against a target with full personal security and strong situational awareness. She proved that the right kind of presence in the right kind of role is operationally superior to any amount of technology aimed at the same problem from a distance. 2 decades later, when Mossad began developing the human intelligence networks that would eventually penetrate Hezbollah at its deepest levels, the Chambers operation was not a historical footnote. It was a template. Long-duration cover operations fail in a specific way. They do not fail suddenly. They fail the way a structure fails, through the accumulation of small stresses, each one individually survivable, until one day something shifts and the whole weight lands on a single point. The operative had been in the neighborhood for more than a year when the first real stress appeared. It did not come from the commander. It did not come from Hezbollah's internal security apparatus, which had no reason to be looking at her. It came from where it almost always comes from in an embedded operation, a detail. Something small. Something that would mean nothing to anyone who was not already suspicious, but that to someone with the right background knowledge did not fit. A visiting relative of one of the women in the household had spent time in the village the operative had named as her origin. Not a long time, a summer, a few months, years ago, but enough to ask questions. Specific questions. The kind that only someone with a real connection to a place asks, and not hostile questions, curious ones. The kind asked by someone who is pleased to find a connection, who wants to compare memories, who is trying to place the new woman in a shared geography. This is the particular danger of a cover built on a real location. A fictional village generates no one who has been there. A real village generates the occasional person who was. The legend builders had understood this and had prepared accordingly. The operative had specific memories, specific landmarks, specific names. But the visiting relative had spent a summer there 8 or 9 years ago, and some of the details she offered did not quite match what the operative had been given. The operative handled it. She had been trained to handle exactly this kind of pressure. She answered what she could answer and expressed grief at what she could not. The village was not the same, she said, after the years of conflict. So much had changed. So many people had left. The questioner accepted this. People always accept grief as an explanation for gaps in memory and inconsistency in detail. Grief is the most powerful cover element in a legend built around loss, because no one pushes back against a widow's silence about painful things. But the questioning had happened, and in an operation where everything depends on the community's unexamined trust, a question that had been asked and answered was not the same as a question that had never been asked. The challenge of communicating this to a handler in a long-duration embedded operation is itself operationally significant. Contact events are rare and carefully managed. The operative cannot send a message every time something goes slightly wrong. She has to assess, triage, and decide what rises to the level of required communication and what she can manage alone. This triage happens inside a cover that she cannot drop in real time without the luxury of a second opinion. She assessed the village conversation as manageable. She did not report it immediately. The handler, when contact next occurred, assessed the situation from the information available and reached a conclusion that created a new problem. The operation was too valuable to abort and not compromised enough to justify extraction. The operative would remain. But the timeline was now different. The question that had been asked would be asked again in some form eventually. Operations do not survive indefinitely in a community. They survive until someone, somewhere, notices the wrong thing. What the handler did not know, and this is the nature of closed-channel operations, was what the operative had already begun to notice on her own. She was becoming real to them. This is a documented psychological risk in long-duration cover operations, acknowledged by multiple former intelligence officers across multiple agencies. It has no clean name, but its mechanism is understood. The longer an operative maintains a cover, the more the cover becomes inhabited. The constructed relationships begin to carry genuine emotional weight. The people who trust her become, in some sense, people she has learned. She knows their patterns, their fears, their affections. She has sat with them in difficult moments. She has been trusted with real things. None of this changes who she is or what she is doing, but it changes the texture of what it costs. An operative who is purely performing a cover can execute a clean exit. An operative who has, over more than a year, become a genuine fixture in people's lives, who has been present at illness and grief and celebration, carries a different kind of weight into every decision about what comes next. There is no training that fully prepares for this. Former Mossad officials have acknowledged it in general terms. Halaby's comment about the heavy burden of signing such an operation was not purely about risk of capture. It was about what sustained cover at this depth does to the person maintaining it. The cover and the person are not, after long enough, entirely separable. The operative's real self is still there, still intact. but it has been sharing space with the constructed self for so long that the boundary between them has worn thin in places. The handler's timeline and the operative's internal experience were no longer the same document. Intelligence produced by a long-duration domestic penetration is not the same kind of intelligence produced by signals interception or aerial surveillance. It is slower to gather, harder to verify, and impossible to collect in volume. What it produces, when it works, is irreplaceable. The commander, whose household the operation was designed to penetrate, was not accessible through any technical means at the level of granularity that targeting required. Signals intelligence can capture a phone call if the right phone is used on the right day. It cannot capture the conversation that happens after the phones are set aside, in the interior of a home where the people present believe themselves to be in the only place they are truly secure. The commander's household, seen from inside its own domestic space over the course of more than a year, yielded a specific kind of knowledge. Pattern is the first thing. When the household was tense, something had happened externally, a meeting, an operation, a decision under pressure. When it was relaxed, there was a reason for that too. The rhythm of a protected man's domestic life is a mirror of his professional calendar, legible to someone present inside it in a way that it is not legible to anyone observing from outside. You do not need to hear the meeting. You need to know that it happened, when it happened, how long it lasted, and what the mood of the household was afterward. That information, cross-referenced with signals intelligence, with aerial observation with other human sources, becomes a map. The New York Times, in its December 2024 investigation into Israel's intelligence operations against Hezbollah, noted that Israeli spy agencies tracked the movements of one top Hezbollah commander through his relationships with 4 mistresses, a detail that no technical surveillance could have surfaced without the prior human intelligence that identified who those women were and where they lived. That is what long-duration human intelligence produces, the connective tissue between known facts, the details that tell you which fact is actually significant. Visitors are the second category. Who comes to the home, and when, and how they arrive, and how long they stay. Not the official meetings. Those happen elsewhere. The informal arrivals, the trusted individuals who appear without announcement, whose presence the household treats as unremarkable. These are often the most operationally significant relationships in a senior figure's life, precisely because they are informal enough to exist outside any documented structure. A man who takes care to vary his official movements may not take the same care with the people he trusts enough to receive at home. That informality is the gap. The third thing is harder to describe. It is the understanding of a person, his temperament, his confidence, his fear, that comes from being present in the space where he is unguarded. A man inside his own home is a different man than the one who appears in any other setting. His decisions, under operational pressure, are shaped by that interior version of himself. Nasrallah, in the weeks before his death, did not believe Israel would kill him. His aides urged him to move to a safer location. He stayed. That judgment, the confidence, the resistance to the advice of people around him came from somewhere inside him, from a reading of the situation that was ultimately wrong. Knowing that interior version of a target is not intelligence in the narrow sense, but it informs every other piece of intelligence about him, and the analysts who receive it know how to use it. What the operative was gathering, over more than a year of presence, was not a file. It was a portrait. That portrait was transmitted through the same careful channel that all long-duration human intelligence uses, slowly, in small pieces, through contact methods that change often enough to prevent pattern analysis by anyone watching the operative's movements. Every contact represents a risk. Every piece of information transmitted is a moment when the operation's existence passes from one person to another. The discipline of long-duration operations is precisely the discipline of managing that transmission, knowing what is worth the risk of contact and what can wait. Inside the household, the operative waited. She was present at a birthday. She helped with a meal. She sat with the woman of the house during an afternoon when the children were at school, and the conversation moved, as conversations in communities shaped by violence always eventually move, to the people who were gone. She listened. She responded with her own loss, the loss she had been given in the legend and had, by now, inhabited so completely that she could no longer entirely separate it from her own interior life. The woman across from her was telling her something true. The operative was telling her something that was built to feel true. In the moment in that kitchen, the cover was performing its function without effort. That effortlessness is what 2 years of accumulated presence produces. The cover was no longer being maintained, it was being lived. And somewhere between those two things, the maintained cover and the lived one, is the territory that no debrief ever fully maps. In that kitchen, with that exchange, the cost of the operation working perfectly was something that would only become legible later, and only to the person who had paid it. Operations of this kind end one of two ways. They end because the objective is complete. Enough intelligence has been gathered. The asset has served its purpose, and the risk of continued presence now outweighs the value of continued access. Or they end because something changes. A suspicion, a pressure, a detail that cannot be explained. This one ended because the timeline had been running too long. Extraction from a long-duration embedded operation is its own operation, with its own risks. The operative cannot simply leave. A sudden departure generates exactly the kind of questions that a long-duration cover is designed to prevent. The disappearance of a fixture is more remarkable than the disappearance of a stranger. The neighbors know her. The family knows her. Her absence will be noticed, discussed, and eventually, in a community that has Hezbollah's internal security apparatus operating within it, reported. The exit had to be a story, like the entry. A family situation in the South, a surviving relative, an obligation, something that required her to leave but could be expected to be temporary. The departure had to be emotional enough to feel real, practical enough to be unquestioned, and ambiguous enough that no one would be surprised if she never returned. In communities where displacement is constant, where people leave for reasons that cannot always be explained, a woman who goes and does not come back is not, by itself, suspicious. She said her goodbyes. She was embraced. She was told she would be missed, that she must come back, that she must write. She said she would try. She left her room as it was. A woman who expects to return does not strip a room, and walked out of the building with one bag. She did not come back. The women in the household talked about her for weeks. They worried. They hoped she was all right. In a community where loss is already the baseline condition, one more disappearance is absorbed without crisis. Grief is familiar. Departure is familiar. The assumption, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, is that life has taken her somewhere else, as life takes everyone somewhere, in a country that has been at war longer than most of its people have been alive. Hezbollah's internal security apparatus, in the period following her exit, found nothing. There was nothing to find in the room, nothing in the relationships, nothing in the pattern of her behavior across more than a year of presence that triggered review. She had been what she appeared to be. The community's memory of her was the memory of a quiet woman who had arrived with grief and left with obligation. That memory is not a security file. It is not a flag. It is just a story about someone who was there for a while and then was not. The intelligence she had gathered, the portrait, the pattern, the visitor log, the domestic map of a protected man's life, had already been transmitted. It was already being cross-referenced, analyzed, integrated into a targeting picture that would take years to complete, and that, when it was used, would not be traceable to a woman who once sat in a kitchen and listened to someone tell her the truth. That is how the method works when it works completely. The source disappears before the consequence appears. The distance between the gathering and the use is long enough that no thread connects them. This is also what makes it, in a specific sense, the most corrosive method in intelligence work, not for the target, for the operative. Erica Chambers received the Medal for Distinguished Service. She disappeared from public record. Her current status is unknown. The British passport bearing her name, the one found in the Beirut apartment after the Soleimani assassination, eventually generated diplomatic complaint. In 1986, the British Foreign Office confronted Israeli Ambassador Yehuda Avner about the use of forged British passports. Avner did not confirm or deny. Chambers herself has said nothing, publicly, about anything. She is one of the most consequential operatives in the documented history of Mossad's female field agents, and she remains, by design, invisible. Susan Wareham was a British secretary. She was not a target. She was not near a target. She was in the wrong place on a Tuesday afternoon when a convoy she had no reason to fear passed a car she had no reason to look at. She died in the explosion that killed Ali Hassan Salama. Her name appears in the record. Her story ends there. The West German nun who died alongside her is named in some accounts, unnamed in others. She was also not a target. She was also just there. Mohammed Shawraba, the Hezbollah operative who confessed to spying for Israel, whose arrest Nasrallah acknowledged publicly in January 2015, joined Hezbollah as a young man in the early days of the organization's existence. He had, by all accounts from sources close to the group, participated in attacks against Israeli soldiers during the occupation of southern Lebanon. He made contact with Mossad, sources said, out of internal frustration with Hezbollah leadership. Not ideology, not money primarily, but the particular anger of a man who felt his contributions had gone unrecognized. He was held by Hezbollah after his confession. His fate after that detention was not publicly confirmed. In a closed organization that regards internal betrayal as the gravest possible offense, the likely outcome requires no elaboration. Mohammed Hadi Saleh was a Lebanese singer. He was embedded in circles connected to Hezbollah. He was arrested in May 2025 and charged with providing Mossad with maps and coordinates of key Hezbollah sites that were later struck in Israeli operations. He is in a Lebanese jail awaiting trial. He was, by the account of security sources, recruited and trained, then used during the height of the 2024 war. A singer, a man whose public identity was built around performance and community connection, a cover of a different kind, one he likely did not experience as a cover at all until it was too late. As of the ceasefire of November 2024 and its aftermath, Lebanese military courts had charged more than 41 individuals with spying for Israel. Some had already escaped. Some were held by Hezbollah in conditions that are not subject to any legal review. Some were still moving freely inside Lebanon, according to security sources, their identities not yet known to the organization they had been reporting on. The woman who posed as a war widow is not in any of these files. She is not in any file that is publicly accessible. She may not exist in the form described here. The specific operation is a reconstruction, not a confirmed record. What exists is the method, the precedent, and the pattern. What exists is Erica Chambers on a balcony with a remote detonator, watching a convoy she had spent months preparing to destroy. What exists is a Mossad director saying, years later, that she was the one who decided when to pull the trigger, and that she did it almost on her own in a city that did not know her real name. What exists is the category of person she represents. The operative who enters a community through the door that grief opens, who becomes trusted through the slow accumulation of small, ordinary acts of presence, and who, when the operation is complete, leaves as quietly as she arrived. The community absorbs the absence. The security apparatus finds nothing. The intelligence is already gone. The women in the household, the ones who brought her food and trusted her in their kitchen and told her things they would not have told a stranger, they will not know, in any version of events that becomes public, what was gathered in those conversations. They will not know that the woman they welcomed was not the woman they thought they knew. They will carry a memory of a neighbor who came and left, and that memory will be accurate in every detail except the one that matters. That is what the method costs, and who pays it. Hassan Nasrallah did not know he was being tracked. By the time Israeli forces assassinated him on September 27, 2024, in a bunker beneath Beirut's southern suburbs, the intelligence architecture that made the strike possible had been decades in construction. Signals intelligence, cyber operations, aerial surveillance, all of it was real, all of it contributed. But the foundation, the layer underneath all the technology, was human. It was people inside Hezbollah's world who had been turned, or recruited, or simply observed over long periods of time by operatives who had learned to be unremarkable. The New York Times, drawing on 10 current and former American and Israeli officials, reported in December 2024 that Mossad had tracked Nasrallah's movements for years before the strike. He did not believe Israel would kill him. His aides urged him to move. He stayed, in part because he trusted the security culture his organization had built. The compartmentalization, the internal vigilance, the closed community that knew how to identify a stranger. He was right about almost all of it. What he could not account for, what no closed security culture can fully account for, is the person who is not a stranger. The person who arrived before the suspicion, who became part of the fabric before anyone thought to question the weave. The person whose presence is explained perfectly by the most familiar story a community knows. A woman who lost someone, who came looking for a place to survive her loss, who sat in kitchens and helped with meals and listened to the things that people tell each other when they believe they are among their own. The operation described in this film does not appear in any public record. What appears in the public record is everything that made it possible: the method, the precedent, the confirmed infiltrations, the documented fact that Mossad's human intelligence networks inside Hezbollah ran deeper and longer than the organization ever knew. The specific woman, the specific commander, the specific conversations in a specific kitchen, those belong to the category of things that a 50-year non-disclosure rule was designed to protect. But Erica Chambers is in the record. Her name, her cover, her balcony, the morning she fed stray cats, and the afternoon she pushed a button. She is in the record as proof of the principle that the domestic cover, inhabited completely over sufficient time inside the right community, can reach places that no other method can reach. She received a medal. She disappeared. The people she left behind in Beirut had no idea what had passed through their lives. The cover that works best is the one that leaves the community with a story it believes long after the operation is over. The war widow's story was always going to end with her leaving. In a country where that story is as common as rain, nobody expected it to mean anything else. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Ops for new documentaries every week.